Hi, this is your first mini lecture, and there's going to be several of these along the way, and I am really hoping that you will take the time to listen to them because this is what I consider the more important material in class. I did customize your textbook, and a lot of the material is my own, but the mini lectures really help to explain and apply the material that we're learning. And they often give a different perspective too, because as you will learn along this class, I often have a very different perspective on your standard nutritional advice that is given, and a lot of that is due to my personal experience working as a clinical nutritionist. So in this first mini lecture, my goal is to really explain to you why you're in this class. I hope it's not just for credit, although I know that for many of you it is just for credit. But as you start working your way through the class, I hope that you'll really find that this is far more beneficial to you than just simply getting the credit for it. Nutrition applies to all of us. It doesn't matter if you're a math major, a business major, a health major. Nutrition is important for you. And so in this first mini lecture, I really want to instill for you a passion for this subject, or at least motivate you and stimulate your interest in it. So it's going to be fairly quick, but we're going to give a broad overview as to why nutrition really is important. And there's 5 main areas that I would like to look at. First, America is clearly getting sicker. Something needs to change. Chronic disease is out of control, and this is not something we used to hear of. Chronic disease is long-term diseases. It's not your short-term, you fell, scraped your knee, go to the doctor, get it fixed, it heals, you're done. Chronic disease lingers for a long time. It debilitates people. It affects their quality of life. It often requires them to be on medications lifelong, and ultimately it is the cause of death for most people. Obesity has now become an epidemic in our country. It's not only a health burden, it is an economic burden. So nutrition is about economy too. It's economics. You'll find that nutrition is not just science. If you think you signed up for a chemistry class, you can be assured it's not just about chemistry. In fact, very little is chemistry. It's a health class, it's an economics class, it's a politics class. And we're also going to talk about real briefly some of the radical changes that have taken place in the last perhaps 75 years that has really been the cause of all of these other changes. So moving along here, let's first talk about the epidemic of sickness. And let me see if I can get my pen ready. All right, we certainly are in an epidemic of sickness. 7 in 10 deaths are related to chronic disease. And as I just explained, chronic disease is ongoing. So this is significant. That means that 70% of us aren't just dying from natural causes. We are dying from chronic disease. Chronic disease is often something, too, that is caused by lifestyle choices that have been made over the course of a long time. And unfortunately, they then change our genetics and they get passed on to our children. So we're seeing generations that are also suffering the effects of our choices and the choices of our grandparents. So chronic disease is a big deal. 1 in 2 American adults have at least one chronic illness, 50% of us, whether it be diabetes, whether it be heart disease, whether it be an autoimmune condition, arthritis even. All of those are chronic conditions. So there's good news, but there's bad news. We're living longer. Nobody can really deny that, but extended lifespans also make us more susceptible to chronic diseases like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. In fact, chronic diseases, again, account for 70% of deaths. And it's not just expanded lifespans. A lot of our lifespans are expanded because of great medical advances. We can do things today that we've never been able to do before that do extend our lifespan. But the question is always, what about the quality of life? And how many years are you living a good quality life? 80% of older Americans, 65 and older, have at least one chronic illness. So even though 50% of American adults, that's 18 to whenever, when you get to be 65, it's gone up to about 80. So heart disease is one of those big, major chronic conditions, and certainly heart disease also is still considered our top #1 killer of all Americans. and it has been ever since 1920. It's a huge economic burden, 108.9 billion. I think this number is quite a great deal higher than when this particular slide was out too. 600,000 annual deaths, at least 25% of all US deaths. But it's not just the cost of healthcare that is the biggest problem here, but also lost productivity. So this affects our economy in a really big way. It affects our workforce. Cancer, this is the dreaded word nobody wants to hear. This is the #1 killer of all Americans under the age of 85. So if you include over 85, heart disease is still our #1 killer. But if you get rid of the population, 85 and older, cancer is now our #1 killer. So even though Nixon declared a war on cancer back in the 70s, we are not really winning this battle yet. It is pretty scary. And our options for treatment are still the same: chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery. So this is a big concern, and almost everyone knows someone who has cancer. Lung cancer due to tobacco use is still the #1 cancer. If you got rid of lung cancer, then actually breast cancer would be the next biggest. Pancreatic cancer is another big one. So of all the types of cancers, though, diet is the greatest contributing factor for up to 60% of all cancers. Smoking is second. So this is a big deal. You have to ask the question, why are we not addressing food? If diet is the biggest contributing factor of getting cancer, why are we not talked to about our diets? And why is our diets not changing? And according to this, the American Cancer Society states all over their website how many cancers are actually affected by diet, but yet diet doesn't remain either a part of prevention or treatment. It just seems to me that there's a problem if we can admit it's a contributing factor, but we're not addressing it. So this is another reason why nutrition is very important. The other scary thing about the risk with cancer, 1 in 2 men will end up with a type of a cancer, usually lung cancer or prostate cancer. 1 in 3 women actually are getting breast cancer. And this number is not going down. None of these numbers are going down, which really begs the question, what are we doing wrong? What happened to our war on cancer? What happened with all the research? The other issue too is the issue of the survival rate. So we say that, or I should say, the numbers have been skewed in such a way where they said back in 1949, 49% of the people were actually surviving cancer, whereas today 68% of people are actually surviving cancer. In other words, they're getting it, but then they're considered survivors. So people would look at that and say, well, surely we're doing something right because our survival rate is so much greater today. Well, that's not entirely the whole story. The problem is that survival rates have been skewed. So survival rate is now defined as surviving 5 years after your initial diagnosis. So therefore, if your Aunt Sally ended up with breast cancer and was treated for it, and 5 years later she still doesn't have it, she's considered a breast cancer survivor. But if in year 6 she ends up with recurrent breast cancer again, she is still considered a breast cancer survivor, even though she might die from the second recurrent round of breast cancer. And that's why these numbers look the way they do. It's a skewed definition for a survival rate. So when someone says we're seeing more cancer victims survive, what they're really saying is they're surviving 5 years. So that's one of the big problems there. Diabetes is our 3rd most common chronic condition. And this is a really scary number too. A lot of this is due to America's sugar addiction. Our sugar intake is climbing, and it's still climbing. The bigger problem isn't even necessarily diabetes, but prediabetes. That's the state in which your body's already resistant. It's not functioning, it's resistant to sugar, resistant to insulin. It's not functioning the way it should be. It's trying to produce insulin the way it should, but there's a problem there. Most people are pre-diabetics and we don't know it. So when you're looking at actually diagnosed diabetes, here, and let me get my pen. So here's our actual number of diagnosed people. Here's our number of undiagnosed people who have diabetes, but then look at the number of those of us who have pre-diabetes. It's significant. So, and of course, with this particular percentages here, you can see back in 1980, there were only 3.5% that were actually diagnosed within the year of having diabetes. Now it's up to 9%. That was in 2011. So roughly speaking, one generation, 30 years, it increased by, well, from 3% to 9%. That's a 3 times increase by 3 times. If you consider that particular projection, well, in another generation, if you increase 9% by 3 times, we're at 30%. Go that one more generation, well, if there's 30% of us that have diabetes and it continues to increase by 3 times, we eventually, all 100% of America could have diabetes eventually. So diabetes is a very scary condition because it leads to heart disease and cancer also. Obesity. The obesity statistics are unbelievable. It's continuing to rise. Back in 1990, you can see the whole country was basically, the obesity rate was anywhere from 7% to roughly 13, maybe 15% in a few states. But consider just 23 years later what it looks like. Now we're anywhere from 24 to 30%. Okay, and our average rate right now is 30%. That was one generation. Again, that's pretty scary with how quickly we have climbed. And you have to ask the question, where's it going to end? When are we going to stop? So obesity does definitely cost us. It's not just an issue of what looks good, what's attractive. You know, it's not an issue of whether you even care or not. It has nothing to do with that, really. It's the impact that it has on our health, on our longevity, on our medical system, on our employment and our workforce, even in our military. Our military is actually afraid of the obesity statistics because too many young men trying to enter the military are too obese and therefore they don't qualify. So even our safety is at risk. But the obesity costs are really quite significant. So 147 billion annual direct medical costs. But then you also have some indirect healthcare costs too. But look at the lost productivity. That's even more than the direct medical costs. And that's where our problems really exist. The total excess costs related to the current prevalence of adolescent overweight and obesity is estimated at 254 billion. So this is eliminating adults now. This is adolescents who are either overweight or obese. And as we'll learn later on, if a child is obese, it is almost always likely that they will be an obese adult. It's very difficult to get rid of obesity as an adult if you were an obese child. And we're seeing more and more children fall into this category. If the current trends in the growth of obesity continue, total healthcare costs attributable to obesity could reach 957 billion by 2030. That's huge, and that's very, very frightening. So the epidemic of childhood obesity is really, really significant. I want to first take a look at statistics. In the 1980s, 11% of children were considered obese. In 2007, so this is 27 years later, approximately one generation, now our obesity rate for children is 34%. Look at, again, there's a 3 times difference there. So if you take this one more generation, if we don't get a handle on this, again, theoretically, what's 34% times 3? That's almost 100% of our children as being obese, and we certainly can't let that happen. So what are some of the effects of obesity on children? Obese children have an 80% chance of being obese adults. They end up with joint problems, asthma, high blood pressure as a child, type 2 diabetes, poor self-esteem, heart disease, and a whole lot more. So it really is something that we have to get a handle on. The question too is why? Why are we seeing this? Believe it or not, there's some behavior and some dietary behaviors that we're starting to engage in this generation, more so than in previous generations, is really contributing to this problem. Believe it or not, I found this staggering, but 1 in 5 infants actually drink soda. I have met moms who will give their infants soda and think nothing of it. Soda is primarily sugar. So you're starting infants on sugar, which just sets them up for not only obesity, but diabetes, heart disease, cancer, a whole host of problems. And we'll discuss sugar in great detail in later chapters. Only 4% of states actually require schools to make fruits or vegetables available to students whenever food is offered. So the school foods are definitely impacting the health of students. It's terrible sometimes what kids are actually fed and the quality, and we'll learn about that as well. Only 3 out of 10 high schoolers actually eat vegetables every day. Only 30% vegetables should be the primary component of our diet. That's where all of our vitamins and minerals and antioxidants exist. Antioxidants prevent cancer. So if you're not eating your vegetables, then you're basically setting yourself up for cancer. And high schoolers, if it's starting as young as in high school, then think of a lifetime of not eating adequate vegetables or any vegetables, what your risk of getting cancer would be. It's significant. Soft drinks, and this is, again, there's some politics that are kind of thrown in here because they do impact all of this. So nearly 65% of school districts actually received 1% of soft drink sales. Okay, it's to their benefit to be selling soft drinks as opposed to water. 32%, 33% of districts received cash incentives in exchange for soft drink sales. So it's not always about the health of the child. A lot of this is economic and political. 2/3 of high schoolers drink either soda, sports drinks, or other sugar-sweetened beverages 1 or more times a day. It is the primary source of sugar calories for children and adolescents are the drinks. Activity is the other component that we're really seeing changing. Only 1 in 4 children do not participate in any physical activity, 25%. And this has really been changing the last generation or two. When I was a kid, there wasn't a lot of technological stuff out there. There wasn't even the internet out there. There weren't cell phones. There weren't things like that. You come home from school, you go outside and play. And that was after 3 different recess periods at school. So outdoor activity was just a given. Children did that. And I understand that there's a lot that's changed today in terms of even safety of neighborhoods, where you can go to play. But regardless, we have far few children outside playing and being creative and getting fresh air today than what we did even just a generation or two ago. Less than 25% of high schoolers take gym classes. The average child spends 7.5 hours a day using entertainment media. This isn't just TV, this is tablets, it's cell phones, it's computers, it's all kinds of stuff. 7.5 hours a day on screen time. 4.5 hours are spent watching TV. I'd say is probably higher because, again, TV is almost going out. Now it's let's watch it on your phone, let's watch it on your tablet, or watch it on the computer. There's a lot of other elements and ways to be, again, in front of a screen. It's screen time. And screen time has far more impact on our health than just simply the fact that it causes us to be sedentary. And we won't get into a lot of detail, but the whole element of the blue light and how that affects the sleep patterns, how it affects sugar metabolism. There are lots and lots of studies out there really bringing to light the health impact of just being in front of a screen as much as what we are now, and especially for children and what it's doing to their brain and their ability to learn and process and reason and logic and all of that. So it's very interesting. Each daily hour of TV increases the prevalence of being overweight by 2%. So again, a sedentary lifestyle is adding to our weight problems. This has always been an amazing statistic. In terms of wealth, we are one of the top countries, but our health is among the least. So we are the wealthiest and the unhealthiest nation, if you want to look at it that way. And here, again, you can look at our total health expenditure. We are way above most other countries. We spend way more on healthcare, but yet we are still amongst the most unhealthy. And I'd say that's a pretty lousy return on investment for those of you who are into the finances. So what's our current health status? Clearly, we are eating too much. Although we will learn in this class, it's not so much an issue of amount as it is what we are eating. We are exercising too little, and we are certainly dying too soon, although some could probably debate that. I'd say the issue is more, what kind of a quality of life do we have? So just looking generally speaking at some health statistics, right now, if you consider those Americans who are both overweight and obese, that's 68% of us. 86% of the American workforce is overweight, obese, or has a chronic health condition. 25% of Americans don't exercise at all. So what's the prescription? We are certainly obese and unhealthy, but the prescription must include good nutrition, and that's why this class is going to make a difference. Several students have at the end of the semester said, wow, I have changed so many things in my life, and it has really helped me and my family significantly. And that's really my goal in this class, and that's what I hope you will see too as you work through this class, is how does this help you and your family and your friends? So last, we're going to take a quick look at what's gone wrong. Why are we seeing all these health problems? And I would submit to you that a lot of it is a change in our food. This was back in the 1950s, so we're looking at approximately 70 years ago. You know, the animal meat that we ate, the animal products, the butter, the milk, animals were raised on a farm. So the cows in the middle here on the picture, that was pretty standard. That was your standard farm. That's where your meat came from. That's where your milk came from. Most of your meals were home cooked. There wasn't a lot of convenience. There wasn't fast food, in fact. Meals were made from scratch. So therefore, they didn't have a lot of added chemicals. They didn't have to be preserved. They didn't have to have a high shelf life. They weren't frozen, they weren't imported. A lot of it was really cooked at home, so therefore it just made a situation in which it had to be a little bit fresher. Getting back to the meat too, cows ate differently, and we're going to get into this in one of the chapters particularly. They fed grass, or they ate grass. There wasn't a whole lot of grain, maybe some hay and stuff thrown in there. They were out in the fresh air, they roamed, they grazed. That impacts the quality of the meat significantly and the dairy that they produce. So there were different nutrients in dairy and in meat compared to today because of how our animals are raised today. Everything is what we would now deem free range, grass-fed. They were local. That was just a given. We didn't have milk that had hormones added to it. Today, cows are given a lot of hormones. We didn't have milk that was homogenized. Homogenization is a process that mixes the cream and the milk together. Instead, it was fresh from the cow. Well, homogenization, we have started to realize, creates very, very fine fat particles that they think is helping to increase the LDL, or the bad cholesterol, in people's bodies. Meats today are what we call irradiated because they contain so much bacteria because of the manufacturing processes that now we utilize new techniques to try to kill the bacteria on the meat. Genetically modified foods too. Nearly 80% of our diet today is genetically modified. It was not in the 50s. Foods were pretty much local. You know, whatever was grown on the farm down the road is what you ate. A lot of times you'd make your own bread. You wouldn't buy your own bread. So this was the landscape of our diet and our nutritional habits. Again, just 70 years ago, that's not that long ago. This is what it looks like today. There are a lot of convenience foods. It's almost all about convenience. Well, convenience is nice and it certainly saves time, not always money, but the problem is that in order to make things convenient, they have to be shelf stable. They have to have ingredients that won't go bad. There has to be a whole lot of different manufacturing techniques applied to keep foods from spoiling. So therefore, we see far more packaged foods, far more boxed foods, far more canned foods, anything that's preserved we're using. A lot of fast foods. Fast food was a novelty back in the 50s. It was just a new and booming thing. In fact, it's because of the fast food industry that now our meat supply is radically different. So in the 50s, the entrepreneurial brothers, the McDonald brothers, created the concept of fast food. within about 10 years, you had Burger King, you had Taco Bell, other people taking what the McDonald's brothers created and taking it into different avenues or different types of foods. When fast food came out, people loved it. But when they went to McDonald's in California, they also wanted the same McDonald's in Florida to have the same food, and they wanted it to taste the same. Well, in order to do that, it all had to be manufactured from a central facility. So therefore, they started taking animals and they basically put them all into one big farm and industrialized the process of raising meat. So as you see down here, these are now pictures of factory farmed meat. Animals are no longer allowed to graze. They're not fed on grass. They're fed grains. They're fed a lot of supplement materials. They're fed hormones and steroids. They're fed antibiotics to have to deal with the bacterial supply from being raised in this manner. All of this impacts the nutrition of the dairy that they produce and of their meat supply. And so then this indirectly affects our health as well. And we're going to learn about this in a significant way in later chapters. We had far more institutionalized meals too. More kids eat at school than they do at home. And the school lunch program is often, in most public schools, is not the healthiest. In fact, the government will purchase the most unhealthy foods, the lowest quality meats and vegetables in order to supply the schools, the prison systems, the WIC programs, the other government food subsidies that exist. So this is a big part of why our health looks the way it does too. Within 1-2 generations, 70 years, this was our food supply, and now it looks like this. So you have to ask the question again, can we just ignore nutrition? Is it really due to just genetics? I don't think so. I think nutrition has a huge impact on why our health is the way it is, and it has to be part of the solution too. If we're really going to get a handle on obesity, chronic illness, which includes cancer, heart disease, diabetes, that is really what this class is about. So I hope that that's given you just a little bit of an inspiration as to what's coming up in the future as we dive into each of these topics individually. And more than anything, I hope that you really enjoy this class and you have a much better appreciation for what you put in your body.